You wanted to know how Concorde became the fastest airplane in the world, and that is exactly what I will show you today. Imagine flying from New York to London so fast that you arrived before you left, a reality only this jet could create for you. This video is not a history lesson, it's a thrilling ride inside the most advanced machine ever built for passenger flight, filled with incredible secrets. But did this ultimate dream of speed carry a secret defect that would eventually destroy everything? Part 1. The impossible challenge of breaking the sound barrier. Imagine you're sitting in a soft leather armchair, sipping coffee, while flying at twice the speed of sound. You look out the window and see the curvature of the earth, the sky darkening like space, and you're crossing the Atlantic Ocean faster than a bullet fired from a rifle. The Concorde wasn't just an airplane. It was a time machine that made the trip from New York to London in under 3.5 hours, which is less time than it takes to drive from New York to Washington, D.C. on a day with bad traffic. But pay attention to this. There's a secret hidden in the curved nose of this aircraft that almost prevented it from ever leaving the drawing board. Something so dangerous that it involved temperatures capable of melting ordinary metal. But I'll talk more about that in a moment. It all began in the 1950s during the Cold War, when the United States and Europe were in a frantic race to see who would dominate the skies. Engineers wanted something beyond anything anyone had ever seen. They wanted you to be able to have breakfast in Manhattan and arrive in time for lunch in Paris. To achieve this, the plane would need to fly at over 2,000 kilometers per hour. That's like covering 20 American football fields every second. Imagine the engine of a regular car, now multiply its power by thousands of times. How did this happen? Well, the French and the British decided to join forces, and the United States government watched closely, trying to create its own supersonic jet, the Boeing 2707. The world was ready for the future. But there's a problem. When you fly that fast, the air ahead of the plane can't get out of the way in time. It builds up and creates an invisible wall called the sound barrier. When the plane passes through this wall, it generates a sonic boom so loud it can shatter windows and houses on the ground. The Concorde was an engineering masterpiece, but it carried a birth defect that terrified residents of cities like Boston and Miami. Why would they insist on a design that caused so much noise and consumed so much fuel? Before we continue, subscribe to the channel so you'll always receive updated content when it's posted. The reason is that the Concorde was the ultimate symbol of status and power. However, to overcome air resistance, they had to design delta-shaped wings, which look like a large triangle. These wings were perfect for flying fast, but terrible for landing. The nose of the plane was so long that pilots couldn't see the runway when descending. Therefore, the solution was to create a nose that tilted downwards as if the plane were looking at the ground during landing. It's not what you think. You might think the hardest part was the nose or the wings, but the real nightmare was the heat. At that speed, the friction with the air caused the fuselage to heat up so much that the plane would stretch about 15 to 30 centimeters during flight. That's almost the size of an entire school, ruler disappearing and reappearing in the jet's structure. Have you ever seen a plane grow and shrink in mid-sky? Comment below if you would have the courage to fly in a machine that changes size while you're inside. It's crucial that you understand how they solved this heat problem, because in the second part, I'll show you how a small flaw in a tiny piece of metal was able to bring down this giant of the skies. Stay with me until the end, because the story of what happened on Flight 4590 completely changes how we see air safety today. The Concorde was invincible, but fate had something in store that no one expected. Therefore, the Rolls-Royce Olympus engines needed an afterburner system, the same one used in fighter jets like the F-15, to be able to propel all that weight through the dense air. Part 2. The cost of speed and the day the world stopped. The Concorde reigned supreme at airports like JFK in New York. Watching that white silhouette take off was like watching a NASA rocket launch to the moon. But to keep this king on the throne, airlines spent a fortune. Imagine that every time the pilot stepped on the accelerator to break the sound barrier, the plane consumed fuel as if trying to empty an Olympic-sized swimming pool in a few minutes. To give you an idea, it consumed more than 25,000 liters of kerosene per hour. That's enough to fill the tanks of more than 500 passenger cars in the United States at once. But there's a problem. There's a piece of metal, only 40 centimeters long, lost on a runway that changed the fate of aviation forever, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Why would anyone pay $10,000 for a ticket if the plane consumed so much time? The answer was simple: time. For a Wall Street businessman, gaining 4 hours a day was worth every penny. The Concorde offered ultra-luxury service with lobster and champagne served while you flew at 18 kilometers altitude. At that altitude, you are above 90% of the Earth's atmosphere. Pay attention to this. If the windows were the size of those on a regular Boeing, the air outside would be so thin that in case of decompression, passengers wouldn't even have time to put on their oxygen masks. That's why the Concorde's windows were tiny, the size of a postcard. How did this happen? People accepted the small windows for the pleasure of arriving in London even before the time they left New York, due to the time difference. It was literally traveling to the past. But it's not what you think. The Concorde's biggest enemy wasn't technology, but rather economics and politics. The United States banned the Concorde from flying over the American continent because of the noise from the sonic boom. Imagine living on a farm in Kansas and hearing an explosion in the sky every time a plane passes. Therefore, the jet was limited to ocean routes, which drastically reduced the number of cities it could visit. Don't forget to keep watching until the end, because the third part reveals the exact moment when the world's most advanced technology became obsolete and what remains of that dream today. Comment below. Would you pay the price of a small car to cross the ocean in 3 hours? Everything seemed to be under control until July 25th, 2000. Flight 4590 was speeding down the runway at Charles de Gaulle Airport, but there was a problem. A Continental Airlines plane that took off minutes earlier dropped a strip of titanium on the runway. When the Concorde's tire ran over this piece at 300 kilometers per hour, it exploded. Heavy pieces of rubber, like bowling balls, were launched against the wing where the fuel tanks were located. Why would such a small piece cause such a huge disaster? The shock wave from the rubber hitting the wing caused the tank to rupture from the inside out. Fuel began to leak and ignited the engines. The plane ascended, engulfed in flames, but it lacked the power to continue flying. Therefore, the accident in Paris not only took lives, but also destroyed the unwavering confidence the world had in the safety of supersonic aircraft. It is crucial that you watch part 3, because in it, I will tell you how the September 11th attacks and the cost of replacement parts delivered the coup de grace to the Concorde. Stay tuned, because the end of the story is more exciting than the beginning. The world was changing, and the metal giant was about to become a museum piece. Therefore, investigations showed that the design needed extremely expensive overhauls of the fuel tanks, making what was already expensive almost impossible to sustain. Part 3. The last dive into the horizon. The Concorde tried to rise again after the Paris tragedy. Engineers worked day and night to reinforce the tanks with Kevlar, the same material used in American police bulletproof vests. They wanted to prove that the king of the skies was still safe and unbeatable. In 2001, the plane flew again, but the world it found was completely different. A few weeks after its return, the attack on the Twin Towers in New York changed everything, creating a global fear of flying and collapsing the luxury travel market. But there's a problem. There's a detail about the last flight that almost no one noticed, a coincidence involving the first pilot and the final farewell, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. The economies of the United States and Europe entered a difficult spiral. Companies that previously paid exorbitant airfare for their executives now preferred video calls, which were beginning to emerge. Why maintain a machine that cost millions to fly if the seats were becoming empty? Pay attention to this. The maintenance cost of a single Concorde was so high that for the same amount, it was possible to maintain an entire fleet of smaller, more efficient aircraft. It was no longer a question of being the fastest, but rather the most profitable. How did this happen? Airbus, which manufactured the spare parts, decided it would no longer provide support for the aircraft. Without parts, the Concorde was like a classic race car without a mechanic, a museum piece waiting to happen. It's not what you think. Many believe it stopped only because of the accident, but the truth is that the cost of fuel and the lack of passengers were the real villains. Imagine that the Concorde consumed about 1 ton of fuel just to taxi from the boarding gate to the runway. That's more than the weight of a compact car like a Ford Fiesta burned before it even left the ground. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel here because it's free, and that way you'll always stay up to date with new videos. Comment what you think. Should the world invest in a new supersonic plane today, or does travel time no longer matter? So on October 24th, 2003, the world stopped to watch the last landing in London. Thousands of people gathered near Heathrow Airport with flags and cameras to see the white bird touch the ground for the last time. It was an emotional moment, as if the future were returning to the past. But there's a problem. With the retirement of the Concorde, humanity, for the first time in the history of technology, took a step backward. We started flying slower than our parents and grandparents flew in the 70s. Why do we accept flying slower today? Current technology focuses on individual screens and onboard Wi-Fi, but nobody crosses the ocean at the speed of a bullet anymore. The secret I mentioned earlier is that many of the pilots who flew on the last day cried like children because they knew that level of engineering would hardly be seen again in our lives. Therefore, the Concorde ceased to be a means of transportation and became a legend. Today, it rests in museums around the world, such as the Intrepid in New York, reminding everyone that for a brief moment, man was able to fly faster than the speed of sound itself. The ultimate cost was the end of an era where the sky had no limits, but the wallet did.